inside the most horrific slavery breeding farms of cotton plantations. Beneath the surface of America's past lies a world where people were bought and sold like cattle, and families could vanish overnight. What forces built this brutal system, and who dared to fight against it? Stay with us as we reveal the hidden stories behind America's struggle with slavery and the quest for justice and freedom. The origins of slavery in America. With just a stroke of a pen, freedom could be stripped away and entire lives were uprooted overnight. Starting in the late 1400s, the transatlantic slave trade cast a shadow across history, one that would haunt millions. For more than 3 centuries, from 1525 to 1866, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were torn from their homes, herded onto ships, and forced to cross a merciless ocean. Only about 10.7 million survived the journey, their spirits battered but unbroken. The early 1600s brought this tragedy to North America's shores. In 1619, a ship quietly docked at Point Comfort, Virginia, carrying around 20 enslaved Africans. It might have seemed like a small event at the time, a single tragic footnote. But in truth, this moment planted the seeds for a system of systematic cruelty that would shape America's future. As Ghanaian scholar Abena Busia once wrote, "The story of the African in the Americas begins with a river of tears and a trail of blood." These words echo through history, capturing the suffering, resilience, and fierce hope of millions. Why did such horror happen? The answer, as cold as it is simple, lies in profit. Colonists saw vast potential in the New World's fertile fields. Tobacco, cotton, and sugar all promised unimaginable riches. At first, they relied on indentured European servants, but demand quickly outstripped supply. Greed took over, and plantation owners began viewing Africans not as people, but as property, commodities to be bought, sold, and exploited in the endless pursuit of wealth, the expansion and entrenchment of slavery. As the 1700s dawned, slavery in America transformed from a collection of cruel practices into an organized, relentless machine. What once seemed like isolated acts of oppression was now a fully entrenched institution, with its grip tightening on both the land and its people. In 1705, Virginia, a colony founded on dreams of liberty, took a dark and fateful step. Lawmakers passed legislation that would echo for centuries. Slaves and their children would be enslaved for life, cementing the brutal concept of chattel slavery. In the eyes of the law, people were no longer just people. They were property, bought, sold, inherited, and treated as mere commodities. What fueled this shift? 2 powerful forces were at play. The first was economics. The southern colonies were rapidly growing, and their prosperity hinged on labor-intensive crops like tobacco, rice, indigo, and soon, cotton. The demand for cheap, controllable labor was insatiable. The second force was fear. As more and more Africans were forcibly brought to America, white colonists grew anxious about potential uprisings and their own grip on power. To maintain their dominance and protect their wealth, they wrote laws that kept enslaved people and their descendants in bondage forever. The hypocrisy of this system did not go unnoticed, even by those at the heart of America's founding. In 1773, Benjamin Franklin, one of the era's most respected thinkers, publicly questioned the logic of the British Empire. He highlighted how Britain could boast about offering freedom to enslaved people who landed on its shores, while simultaneously growing rich from the trade that kept millions in chains. His words expose the deep contradiction at the center of both British and American society, a commitment to liberty on paper, built atop a reality of suffering. But the roots of this system stretched back even further. As early as 1619, the first slave farms appeared in Jamestown, Virginia. What started as a small-scale experiment in forced labor would, over the course of the next century, grow into a vast and powerful engine that fueled the entire Southern economy. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, slavery was no longer just tolerated, it was essential. The daily lives and futures of enslaved men, women, and children were dictated by laws and customs designed to keep them subjugated forever. Then came a turning point that changed everything. Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793. With this new machine, processing cotton became dramatically faster and easier. Suddenly, growing cotton was so profitable that plantation owners rushed to plant it everywhere they could. But this new white gold came at a devastating cost. The explosion of cotton farming in the South drove the demand for enslaved labor to staggering new heights. States like South Carolina saw their enslaved population soar as the region became the world's center for raw cotton production, feeding textile mills in the North and as far away as Britain. By the early 1800s, the institution of slavery had become deeply woven into every aspect of Southern society. Enslaved people weren't just workers, they were the backbone of the economy. They were listed on ledgers, used as collateral for loans, and passed down like family heirlooms. Their bodies, their futures, and their dignity were sacrificed on the altar of profit and greed. But the moral crisis could not be ignored forever. Voices like abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison's grew louder, demanding that America finally confront the true cost of its prosperity. In 1831, Garrison put the nation on notice. "We are going to decide whether the slave-holding, soul-driving system shall be continued." The country stood at a crossroads. Could a society that claimed to value liberty and equality continue to justify such cruelty? As the 19th century wore on, slave farms and plantations spread relentlessly across the South. The richest and most fertile regions along the Atlantic coast, through the Carolinas and Georgia and hugging the Mississippi River, became the heartland of this system. By 1860, the census painted a stark, unsettling picture. Nearly 4 million people enslaved, the vast majority living and working on plantations. Their labor fueled the wealth and comfort of a nation, but their suffering was largely ignored by those in power. This deep entrenchment of slavery left scars that would take generations to heal, and forced America to face its own contradictions in the most painful ways imaginable. Shadows of the Plantation, the harrowing reality of enslaved life. Imagine waking before dawn each day, knowing your fate was never your own. For millions of enslaved people across the American South, life under the shadow of the plantation was a relentless cycle of toil, deprivation, and fear. A world defined by brutality and the daily denial of humanity. As the sun rose over endless fields of cotton, sugar, or tobacco, the enslaved were already at work. Their days began in the darkness and often ended there too. Every hour was measured by the demands of their overseers. Work was grueling, the pace relentless. Men, women, and even children as young as 3 or 4 were expected to pick, chop, haul, or clean from sunup to sundown. In the cotton fields, hands were often raw and bleeding, as workers were forced to meet impossible quotas. Sometimes 200 pounds of cotton a day. Failure to keep up could mean violent punishment, the crack of the whip, or public humiliation in front of family and peers. These punishments were not rare. Overseers ruled with cruelty, using fear to control and break spirits. Frederick Douglass, who was enslaved as a child, recalled in his autobiography how the loudest cries only made overseers beat harder and longer. Moses Roper, who escaped slavery, described witnessing his own mother being beaten even as she gave birth. Her pain ignored, her pleas unanswered. Living conditions offered no refuge. Enslaved families were crowded into tiny, dilapidated cabins, often with dirt floors and leaky roofs. At plantations like Magnolia in South Carolina, as many as 10 people might share a space smaller than a modern bathroom. Privacy was non-existent. Everyone's life was on display and basic dignity was stripped away. There was little protection from the elements. Cold in winter, sweltering heat in summer, rain soaking through at night. Nutrition was barely enough to sustain the backbreaking labor. Food rations were meager, usually cornmeal, a bit of pork fat, and sometimes molasses. Vegetables or fresh meat were rare treats, and malnutrition was rampant. Solomon Northup, in his famous memoir, 12 Years a Slave, remembered receiving only a peck of corn and a few pounds of pork per week. This diet, lacking vital nutrients, left people weak and vulnerable to disease. Outbreaks of cholera, pneumonia, and other illnesses swept through the slave quarters, taking countless lives. Medical care was almost non-existent. When illness or injury struck, enslaved people were often left to suffer without treatment. Some, like Dr. J. Marion Sims, now infamous for his unethical practices, used enslaved people as unwilling subjects for medical experimentation, often without anesthesia. The average life expectancy for an enslaved person in the mid-19th centuries was just 21 years, a stark measure of both the physical and psychological toll. The psychological toll of slavery was deep and relentless, leaving scars that went far beyond the chains. One of the most haunting cruelties was the routine separation of families. Children could be torn from their mother's arms and sold off like livestock. Their cries for comfort ignored, their futures decided in an instant by the highest bidder. Parents were left in anguish, powerless to protect the ones they loved most, forced to live with an ache that never faded. The suffering did not stop there. Enslaved women were especially vulnerable to abuse. The harrowing story of Celia, a young woman forced to defend herself against the relentless sexual assaults of her owner, shows the daily terrors many endured. When Celia fought back, killing her abuser in self-defense, she was not granted mercy or justice. Instead, she was executed, a stark reminder of just how little protection or dignity was afforded to the enslaved, especially women. Former slave William Wells Brown captured the emotional devastation with chilling clarity. "Slavery has fixed a deep gulf, a dark abyss," he wrote, "a chasm of pain, trauma, and loss that separated enslaved people from the rest of humanity." This abyss was filled with grief, broken families, stolen childhoods, and the constant threat of violence and exploitation. It was a darkness that touched every life, casting a shadow that would stretch far beyond the plantation and linger for generations. Did any part of this history change the way you see America's past? Tell us what stood out to you in the comments. Sparks of defiance, resistance, and rebellion. Even under the constant threat of violence and heartbreak, the human spirit among the enslaved was not broken. In the dim glow of the slave quarters, whispers of resistance moved like a secret wind, quiet but unstoppable. No matter how hard the system tried to crush hope, a longing for freedom and dignity always burned. For every chain and every act of cruelty, there was a quiet act of rebellion, a refusal to surrender one's sense of self. Some acts of defiance were subtle, almost invisible to the eyes of overseers. Many enslaved people staged work slowdowns, feigned illness, or deliberately broke tools. These small, everyday disruptions chipped away at the plantation's productivity and frustrated those who claimed ownership over other human beings. Songs became a powerful tool of resistance as well. Frederick Douglass described how spirituals and work songs were more than music. They carried secret messages, plans, and dreams. The act of singing itself was defiant, a reminder that enslaved people still owned their voices and their dreams, even when they owned nothing else. Cultural traditions held strong as well. On the Sea Islands, the shout, a rhythmic call-and-response song and dance, allowed people to express solidarity, pass covert messages, and nurture their African heritage. Through music, dance, and faith, enslaved people created a hidden world of connection and support, right under the noses of those who would deny their humanity. But resistance did not stop at subtle sabotage. Many were willing to risk everything to pursue freedom. The most famous example was the Underground Railroad, a vast, secret network of safe houses and allies stretching from the Deep South to the Free North. Harriet Tubman became the legend of this movement, a woman who escaped slavery herself, then returned again and again, leading at least 70 people to freedom. Tubman's courage was matched by her conviction. I had reasoned. There was one of two things I had a right to: liberty or death. Her example inspired others to believe that freedom was possible no matter the odds. William Still, a free black man in Philadelphia, worked tirelessly to help those escaping bondage, recording the names and stories of over 800 men, women, and children who passed through his care. He later wrote, "The heroism should be kept green in the memory of this in coming generations, honoring the bravery of those who risked everything to break their chains." Rebellion was not limited to escape or sabotage. Sometimes it exploded into open revolt. In 1739, the Stono Rebellion shook South Carolina, as dozens of enslaved Africans seized weapons and struck back, killing slaveholders and marching for freedom. Though ultimately crushed, the rebellion sent shockwaves through the white population and sparked new, harsh laws meant to stamp out future uprisings. Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia in 1831 became one of the most famous insurrections in American history. Turner, an enslaved preacher, gathered around 70 followers and launched a bloody attack that left dozens dead. The retaliation was swift and brutal. Many were executed, and laws became even more draconian. But the fear among slaveholders was unmistakable. The enslaved were never truly powerless. Before his death, Turner declared, "I am loaded with chains, but this is nothing compared to how I have been bound by my fellow creatures," speaking to the psychic pain of bondage that no physical restraint could contain. The German Coast Uprising of 1811, led by Charles de Landais near New Orleans, was the largest slave revolt in U.S. history. Armed with sugarcane knives and sheer determination, as many as 500 enslaved people marched, burning plantations and demanding recognition as men, not beasts. Though violently suppressed, their bold cry, "We will show these whites that we are men, not beasts of burden," echoed through history. Women played a vital role too as leaders and visionaries. Maria Stewart, a free black woman and abolitionist, rallied black women to rise up, declaring, "O ye daughters of Africa, awake! Show forth that you are endowed with noble faculties." Her voice and the courage of women like her galvanized a new generation to demand their rightful place in the fight for liberation. Despite the ever-present danger of retaliation, the flame of resistance never went out. William Wells Brown, once enslaved and later a prominent abolitionist, said it best, "The slave is a thing, a marketable commodity, and yet he is a man." Through rebellion, large and small, enslaved people insisted on their humanity, their dignity, and their right to freedom, no matter how dark the night. Which acts of resistance by enslaved people do you find the most powerful or inspiring, and why? Slavery's central role in America's rise. To truly understand America's emergence as a global economic powerhouse, you have to look beneath the surface, to the fields, the plantations, and the lives of millions who toiled there. Slavery wasn't just an ugly footnote in American history, it was the engine that powered the nation's rise. The rhythmic clang of hammers in the blacksmith shop, the creak of overloaded wagons, and the mournful songs drifting through the fields, these were the true sounds of American progress in the 18th and 19th centuries. By the time of the American Revolution, enslaved people already formed a crucial part of the population, especially in the South. Cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar weren't just valuable crops, they were cornerstones of an economy built almost entirely on forced labor. As the years went on, the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 would supercharge the demand for cotton, and with it, the demand for enslaved labor. What became known as King Cotton quickly dominated the landscape and the balance sheets of Southern planters, whose wealth skyrocketed on the backs of those forced to work their land. By 1860, enslaved people represented nearly 13% of the total U.S. population, almost 4 million souls, the vast majority concentrated in the plantation states of the South. The value of enslaved people as property was estimated at an astronomical $3.5 billion, making them the single most valuable asset in the country, worth more than all the nation's banks, railroads, and factories combined. Cotton alone accounted for over half of all U.S. exports by the mid-19th century, fueling not only the Southern economy but the rise of the North as well, where textile mills processed raw cotton into finished goods. The ripple effect of slave labor was global. British factories ran on American cotton, and merchants from New York to Liverpool profited from every bale that left the docks of New Orleans or Charleston. Politicians and businessmen understood just how central slavery was to American prosperity, and so did those who were enslaved. The economic importance of their labor was reflected in how they were treated, as assets to be insured, traded, mortgaged, and leveraged. Enslaved people appeared in ledgers, court records, and inheritance documents. Their bodies, their skills, and even their future children were calculated into the wealth of their enslavers. The power of slavery stretched far beyond southern plantations, shaping the American economy from top to bottom and reaching overseas. In 1858, Senator James Henry Hammond boldly proclaimed, "Cotton is king, and no power dares to make war upon it." Southern leaders saw cotton and the enslaved labor that produced it as the backbone of American prosperity. Economist James DeBow called the cotton crop the wonder of the age, and with good reason. Fortunes were made from this single commodity. But the wealth generated by slavery didn't stop at the Mason-Dixon line. Northern textile mills depended on Southern cotton, while banks and shipping companies across the country profited from the booming trade. Historian Eric Foner noted that the slave economy had ripple effects, with plenty of merchants profiting from the slave trade, revealing that many in the North were deeply complicit. Internationally, American cotton fueled the British textile industry, driving the Industrial Revolution. By 1860, nearly 80% of the cotton used in British factories came from the American South. As historian Sven Beckert put it, cotton, and with it slavery, became the driving force of a globally interconnected economy. The world's wealth was built, in part, on the suffering and labor of the enslaved. Whispers in the Quarters, the hidden world of enslaved culture. When the fields finally emptied and darkness fell across the plantations, a different kind of life quietly awakened in the slave quarters. In these crowded, weathered cabins, enslaved people carved out moments of comfort, meaning, and resistance far from the eyes of the overseers. Here, family and community took on new significance, offering a fragile sense of belonging in a world determined to break every bond. In the flickering light of a single lamp, elders shared stories from their African homelands, tales of distant rivers, ancestors, and legendary tricksters. These stories did more than pass the time. They preserved memories that slavery tried to erase and gave hope to new generations born in captivity. Frederick Douglass once wrote, "The slave's happiness is not the end sought by slavery. It is necessary to darken his moral vision." But within the quarters, enslaved people refused to let their spirits be extinguished. Through oral traditions, they claimed the right to remember, to dream, and to imagine a future beyond bondage. The culture that blossomed in these quarters was as diverse as the African nations from which people had been torn. Historian Ira Berlin described it as a cultural diaspora, a blend of languages, beliefs, and rituals woven together in the New World. Spiritual life was central and complex. While slaveholders often forced Christianity onto their captives, many enslaved people secretly maintained elements of their original religions, adapting them into new spiritual practices that could be hidden in plain sight. Historian Albert J. Raboteau estimates that by 1860, only about 10% of enslaved people were Christians in the traditional sense. The rest relied on faiths like Vodun, Santeria, and Conjure, African-rooted traditions that brought comfort, hope, and a sense of agency. These beliefs offered healing, protection, and a direct link to ancestors, and they persisted through secret rituals, amulets, and herbal remedies. William Wells Brown, a formerly enslaved writer, remembered, "There was not a man, but that believed in conjuration," a sign of how powerfully these old ways endured. Worship often happened in hidden places, brush arbors or hush harbors, where enslaved people could gather away from the master's gaze. There they could pray, sing, and mourn together, building a sense of unity and spiritual strength. Music and dance became central to this hidden world. Work songs, spirituals, and field hollers echoed across the fields, helping people coordinate their efforts, express sorrow, or signal hope. These songs were more than entertainment. As scholar Lawrence Levine noted, the spirituals are full of double meanings, including secret codes for escape or protest. Songs like Steal Away to Jesus or Go Down Moses spoke of deliverance and freedom, even as they masked their true purpose from white overseers. The Ring Shout, a circular dance blending African and Christian elements, became a powerful expression of community, faith, and resistance. Through rhythmic movement, clapping, and call and response vocals, participants found moments of joy, connection, and even rebellion. In cities like New Orleans, enslaved people gathered in Congo Square on Sundays to drum, dance, and sing, keeping the rhythms of their ancestors alive and building networks that reached beyond the plantation. Family and kinship were the foundation of enslaved communities. Even though families could be shattered at any moment by sale or forced relocation, people worked hard to forge and maintain strong bonds. Historian Herbert Gutman called the family the most significant social unit among the enslaved. Naming practices reflected this determination. Parents often gave children African names or used surnames to declare kinship, defying a system that refused to acknowledge their ties. Historian Brenda Stevenson wrote, "Surnames provided a means to assert self and kin, a quiet yet powerful form of resistance. Claiming one's own name was sometimes a radical act. Sojourner Truth, born Isabella Baumfree, chose a new name after escaping slavery, a symbol of her freedom and her mission as a preacher and activist. Through names, stories, rituals, and traditions, enslaved people affirmed their humanity and their place in a world that sought to erase them. Ultimately, the hidden culture of the quarters was more than survival. It was a form of resistance. Every song sung, story shared, or ritual performed was an assertion of identity and hope. Frederick Douglass captured this spirit when he wrote, "The slave system was utterly hateful to me. I hated everything that reminded me of my condition." In the shadows, enslaved people refused to be defined only by their chains. They built beauty, meaning, and connection, and through that they kept the dream of freedom alive, whispering hope into the darkness. Which story or moment from America's struggle with slavery surprised you the most, and why? The Unshackling, America's long march toward emancipation. By the early 19th century, America was at a crossroads, a nation with a founding promise of liberty, yet shackled by the grim reality of slavery. The battle for freedom would span generations, testing the country's conscience and resolve. It was in 1831 on the cobblestone streets of Boston that a small but determined group of reformers founded the New England Anti-Slavery Society. These were some of the first organized abolitionists in the United States, and among them was William Lloyd Garrison, a fiery journalist whose words would ignite a movement. Garrison was relentless, launching his newspaper, The Liberator, with a promise that thundered through every issue. "I will be as harsh as truth. I do not wish to think with moderation." His insistence on immediate abolition, not gradual change, galvanized allies and enraged opponents, pushing the issue of slavery to the very heart of public debate. But the fight against slavery didn't begin with Garrison or Whittier. Its roots ran deeper back to the Quakers, one of the earliest religious groups to denounce slavery. In 1775, Anthony Benezet, a French immigrant and devout Quaker, founded America's first abolitionist society. As early as 1762, he wrote, "The Negroes are our fellow creatures. They have the same right to liberty that we have." These early voices planted seeds of conscience that would grow for decades. The 19th century saw the abolitionist movement catch fire, powered not only by white reformers but also by the searing testimony of Black Americans who had survived slavery themselves. Frederick Douglass, born into bondage, escaped in 1838 and became a voice that could not be ignored. His speeches and writings shattered the convenient illusions of the North and South alike. Douglas wrote of his childhood, "I have often been awakened by the shrieks of an own aunt, whom he used to tie up and whip." His vivid, unflinching accounts brought the realities of slavery to audiences who might otherwise have looked away. The abolitionists faced towering obstacles. The Southern economy, political system, and social order all depended on slave labor, and those in power were determined to protect their interests. Even some founding fathers who spoke about freedom and the evils of slavery failed to take action. Thomas Jefferson once acknowledged the moral depravity of the slave trade, writing, "The whole commerce is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions." Yet when the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 turned slavery into a profit machine, the hope for a voluntary end to the institution faded. In the South, resistance to abolition grew fierce and violent, but beneath the surface, anger and desperation simmered among the enslaved. In 1831, Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher, led a bloody uprising in Virginia that left more than 50 white people dead. Turner's rebellion shattered the myth of a docile slave population and terrified the South. After Turner's capture, his lawyer Thomas R. Gray described him as a complete fanatic, or plays his part most admirably, a comment reflecting the fear, confusion, and denial many white Southerners felt. The courage of black abolitionists remained undimmed. Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman risked everything for freedom and to help others achieve it. Sojourner Truth, born Isabella Baumfree, became both an abolitionist and a champion for women's rights. Her 1851 speech in Akron, Ohio rang out, "That man over there says, 'Nobody ever helps me, and ain't I a woman?'" Truth's words called out the hypocrisy of a society that denied both women and black people their rights. Meanwhile, the fight over slavery's future raged in Congress and on the frontier. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 forced Northerners to participate in the capture of runaway slaves, sparking outrage and acts of civil disobedience. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, became a cultural lightning rod. Through her story, she humanized enslaved people and exposed the cruelty of their bondage, declaring, "The law of God cannot be repealed by any human enactment." Stowe's words reached across class and regional lines, pushing many to see the moral cost of complicity. As the 1850s wore on, the country lurched toward crisis. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which left the fate of slavery up to voters in new territories, ignited violent clashes known as Bleeding Kansas. Political divisions deepened. The new Republican Party, born of anti-slavery sentiment, rallied behind slogans like "Free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men." Its first presidential candidate, John C. Fremont, carried the banner of abolition to the national stage. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 marked a turning point in American history. Lincoln, a Republican who opposed the spread of slavery, alarmed the South, leading to the secession of 11 states and the eruption of the Civil War. Although the conflict began as a battle to preserve the Union, it soon became inseparable from the issue of slavery. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 declared freedom for enslaved people in the rebelling states, transforming the war into a fight for both unity and human liberty. As the war dragged on, Lincoln reflected on its heavy toll in his second inaugural address, expressing hope for peace and an end to the nation's suffering. The Civil War ultimately resulted in the abolition of slavery with the passage of the 13th Amendment. While the war's end marked a monumental victory for freedom, it was just the beginning of a long and challenging journey toward true equality in America. A journey defined by resilience, moral courage, and an unwavering belief in human dignity. What hygiene was like throughout history? How bad was it? We all know what Roman emperors looked like from statues and coins, but have you ever wondered what they actually smelled like? Or how Versailles nobles, cowboys, and astronauts really kept clean, or didn't? Get ready for some jaw-dropping, bizarre, and downright shocking secrets about hygiene through the ages. Which era do you think was the dirtiest? Stick around. you might never look at history the same way again. Roman emperors, appearances, and hygiene. Let's take a trip back to ancient Rome, a world of power, ambition, and some serious personal grooming standards. When we think of Roman emperors, we imagine grand marble statues and stern faces on ancient coins, but behind the scenes, these powerful men were just as obsessed with their appearance as any celebrity today. Start with Julius Caesar, the man who changed the course of history. Sure, he was a brilliant general and a political genius, but did you know he was also a bit of a trendsetter? In the early days of Rome, long hair and beards were all the rage for men. But Caesar wasn't a fan of the shaggy look. He preferred a cleaner, more polished style. Short hair, clean-shaven, always neatly groomed. Thanks to his influence, this look quickly caught on in the upper circles of Roman society. Suddenly, every ambitious Roman man wanted to look like Caesar. But here's a very human twist. Caesar actually had a big insecurity. He was going bald, and he hated when people made fun of his thinning hair. Roman historian Suetonius tells us that Caesar was meticulous about his looks. He'd pluck out stray hairs and kept what he had carefully combed, but the receding hairline bothered him so much that he developed a clever solution, the classic comb-over. He'd sweep the remaining hair forward from the back of his head, trying to disguise the bald spots. And perhaps the best perk of being emperor? He could wear a laurel wreath whenever he wanted. That wasn't just for style, it doubled as a crown and a handy cover for his thinning hair. And Caesar wasn't alone. Later emperors, just as self-conscious, took their own approaches to hide their imperfections. Emperor Domitian was so worried about his hair loss that he ordered all his official portraits to show him with a full head of hair. When that wasn't enough, he resorted to wearing wigs. Even Emperor Hadrian, famous for reintroducing the beard, likely did so to hide facial blemishes. Personal grooming wasn't just about hair. Emperors stressed over breakouts too. Roman doctors wrote entire texts about treating acne, boils, and other common woes, emphasizing oils, herbal remedies, and sometimes strict diets. For emperors, image was everything. A pimple or a patch of missing hair might not change the course of history, but it certainly shaped how these men wanted to be remembered. Flawless, powerful, and, above all, admired. Roman bathing practices, from strigils to thermae. Step into the daily life of ancient Rome, and you'll quickly discover that public baths weren't just about getting clean. They were at the very heart of Roman society. Forget the modern idea of a quick shower behind closed doors. For the Romans, bathing was a ritual, a social event, and a true mark of civilization. Imagine walking through the stone streets of Rome as the sun sets, the city buzzing with activity. Instead of heading home, people of every class, from senators to merchants to everyday laborers, make their way to the thermae, the grand bathhouses that dominated the city's skyline. These weren't simple pools. The largest thermae were sprawling complexes, complete with hot and cold baths, saunas, exercise yards, libraries, and even gardens. But how did a Roman actually get clean? It all started with oil, not soap. Bathers would slather their skin with olive oil, working it in until they were slick and shiny. Then came the strigil, a small, curved metal tool that looked a bit like a tiny sickle. With practiced movements, the Romans would scrape the oil, sweat, and dirt right off their skin. All of it collected into a little pot, leaving them refreshed and, by ancient standards, remarkably clean. For the wealthy, this entire process was a luxurious affair, performed by slaves or attendants skilled in the art of bathing. For everyone else, it was a do-it-yourself operation, but still an essential part of the day. Romans believed that bathing wasn't just about hygiene, it was also about health, relaxation, and connecting with others. The thermae themselves were marvels of engineering, with sophisticated heating systems, called hypocausts, that kept the floors and water warm. Visitors would move from room to room. The tepidarium with its mild, warm waters, the caldarium, where hot steam rose thick in the air, and finally the frigidarium, a bracing cold plunge to close out the ritual. Some bathhouses even offered open-air pools or gymnasiums for exercise, making the visit a full-body experience. The baths were bustling places. Friends met to gossip. Business deals were struck in the steamy haze, and news from across the empire traveled quickly along marble benches. For a Roman, skipping a visit to the bath was almost unthinkable. Here, personal cleanliness went hand in hand with social status, a daily ceremony that left every participant feeling not just cleaner, but truly Roman. Roman toilets and sanitation, public versus private. When it comes to ancient Rome, there's no denying the city was ahead of its time in many ways. But their approach to sanitation might still surprise you. While the Romans gave the world aqueducts, heated floors, and paved roads, their bathroom habits were, well, a little less glamorous. Step into a bustling Roman city, and you'll quickly notice that privacy wasn't exactly a top priority when nature called. Public toilets, known as latrines, were scattered throughout towns, especially near markets, bathhouses, and busy streets. These weren't the solitary stalls we're used to today. Instead, they were long stone benches, side by side, each with holes carved out at regular intervals. Underneath ran a channel of flowing water to whisk waste away, but there were no dividers or doors. Picture yourself sitting shoulder to shoulder with friends, neighbors, or complete strangers, chatting as you went about your business. As for toilet paper, Romans took a different approach altogether. Each public latrine was equipped with a communal sponge attached to a stick, called a tersorium, resting in a bucket of water or vinegar. After use, it was rinsed and left for the next visitor. It's a far cry from our modern standards, but for the Romans, it was just a part of daily life. The wealthy, of course, had more comfortable options. In the grand villas of Rome's elite, private toilets were a mark of luxury. Marble seats, elaborate plumbing, and even footrests transformed a basic necessity into something almost regal. Some emperors, like Hadrian, went so far as to install multiple private toilets throughout their sprawling estates, showing off not just wealth, but a desire for personal comfort in every corner of daily life. When it came to keeping clothes clean, the Romans showed their resourcefulness, though their methods might raise a few eyebrows today. Laundry workers or fullers used a surprising ingredient: urine. Collected from public urinals, both human and animal urine was prized for its ammonia content, which helped break down grease and dirt in clothing. Clothes would soak in the solution, be stomped on, rinsed, and then hung out to dry in the sun. Roman sanitation systems weren't perfect. Public latrines could get pretty foul, and sharing cleaning tools certainly carried its risks. But their innovations laid the foundation for citywide sewer systems and communal hygiene. Despite the quirks, these practices showed just how advanced and inventive the Romans really were in their quest to keep their cities running, and their citizens mostly clean. Which fact about the way people stayed clean in the past completely surprised you? Hair today, gone tomorrow. Roman emperors and their hair. In the world of Roman emperors, every detail of appearance mattered, but nothing sparked as much anxiety or creativity as a receding hairline. While power and prestige were always on display, a full head of hair was the secret crown every emperor seemed to desire. In fact, worries about thinning hair and bald spots were just as real in ancient Rome as they are today. Take Emperor Domitian, for example. As a young man, he started losing his hair early, and it quickly became his biggest insecurity. Far from accepting his fate, Domitian went on the defensive. He insisted that all official portraits, coins, and statues depict him with a glorious mane, regardless of what was happening on his actual scalp. The reality. Behind the scenes, Domitian was constantly searching for ways to cover up his hair loss. When portraits weren't enough, he turned to wigs, an early adopter of hairpieces long before they became fashionable. This preoccupation with hair wasn't limited to Domitian. Many emperors obsessed over their appearance, especially when it came to hair. Julius Caesar, too, famously hid his baldness with clever comb-overs and his beloved laurel wreath. For emperors, controlling their image meant controlling their legacy. Every curl or lock sculpted on a statue was a subtle statement of youth, strength, and authority. Even everyday Romans took their cues from the palace. When Caesar made the clean-shaven look popular, barbershops flourished across the empire. And when beards came back into style, thanks in part to Emperor Hadrian, who wore one to cover facial blemishes, the trend caught on like wildfire. Being hair-conscious wasn't just a royal quirk. It shaped grooming habits for everyone, from soldiers to senators. The lengths to which emperors went to maintain a youthful look reveal just how much image shaped perceptions of power. Roman historians loved to gossip about these personal details, knowing that a ruler's reputation could hinge on something as simple as a receding hairline. Even with all the resources of an empire, emperors still faced the universal fear of losing their hair, and did everything they could to keep up appearances. Every statue with lush curls, every carefully designed coin, was more than just art. It was an act of image management, an ancient attempt to outsmart time, and proof that even the most powerful men in history had their moments of self-doubt when they looked in the mirror. Dining with Roman emperors, from gluttony to good taste. The dining table was more than just a place to eat in ancient Rome. It was a stage where emperors revealed their personal tastes, quirks, and sometimes their deepest flaws. While the Roman Empire was known for its power and military might, life inside the palaces could be surprisingly intimate, dramatic, and even outrageous, especially at dinner. Take Emperor Augustus, the man who led Rome into a golden age. Despite his enormous power, Augustus was a model of restraint when it came to food. He preferred simple, honest meals, a piece of bread, some cheese, perhaps a few olives or dried fruit. Historians describe him as a man who believed in moderation. Guests at his table would rarely see extravagant feasts. Instead, Augustus set the tone for dignified, wholesome dining, and expected his friends and family to follow his example. But not every emperor could resist temptation. Fast forward to the reign of Claudius, and the scene is almost unrecognizable. Claudius had a reputation for his legendary appetite. He loved to eat and drink at any time, in any place. Banquets under his rule were elaborate affairs, with tables groaning under the weight of exotic dishes, rare meats, seafood, fruits, and wines from across the empire. Stories circulated of the emperor eating through the night, sometimes even falling asleep at the table only to wake up and resume his meal. Guests could never be sure what to expect. A modest supper or a wild, endless feast that tested even the hardiest stomachs. Food in the imperial courts wasn't just about nourishment, it was about power, status, and even political maneuvering. A dinner invitation from the emperor was a high honor, but it came with its own challenges. One wrong move, eating too little, indulging too much, or breaking social customs, could land you on the wrong side of the ruler's favor. Dinners also became showcases for new culinary trends and extravagant tastes. Wealthy Romans prized delicacies like flamingo tongues, dormice stuffed with herbs, and honey-glazed fruits. Meanwhile, chefs competed to invent ever more spectacular dishes, hoping to win the emperor's approval and a place in history. Whether humble or hedonistic, the emperor's table reflected his personality and ambitions. Each meal was a performance, each guest an actor. The choices made at dinner, what to eat, how much to serve, who to invite, could shape friendships, fuel rivalries, and even decide the fate of Rome itself. The Black Death, hygiene and misconceptions in the 14th century. Travel back to the 14th century Europe and you'll find a world teetering on the edge of disaster. The streets are crowded, filth piles up along alleyways, and the air is thick with the stench of waste and unwashed bodies. Few people truly understood what it meant to be clean. And this ignorance set the stage for one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, the Black Death. In those days, most Europeans had little idea how diseases actually spread. The leading theory? Blame it on bad smells. According to the popular miasma theory, foul odors drifting through the city were believed to be the root of sickness. People stuffed fragrant herbs into pouches, hung them around their necks, or placed them in their homes, hoping these sweet scents would shield them from deadly plagues. Unfortunately, these desperate measures did nothing to halt the invisible killers carried by fleas and rats. As the Black Death swept across the continent, killing tens of millions, fear gripped every household. Hygiene, already neglected, became even more precarious. With no plumbing, human and animal waste piled up in the streets, turning cities into breeding grounds for disease. Floors inside homes were often covered with rushes or straw, which trapped dirt, food scraps, and worse, creating havens for pests. People rarely changed these floor coverings, allowing fleas, lice, and rats to multiply in the very places where families slept and ate. Some communities, however, fared slightly better. Historians have noted that Jewish populations in certain areas suffered fewer deaths from the plague. Why? Many now believe it was due to religious traditions that emphasized regular hand washing and stricter rules about cleanliness. Tiny measures that, unknowingly, offered a bit of protection. The panic and confusion of the era led to bizarre treatments. Medieval doctors prescribed bloodletting and strange potions, but nothing seemed to work. Even the dead were considered contagious, leading to hurried burials and widespread terror. People didn't need microscopes to realize that the disease was spreading rapidly. They just lacked the tools to fight back effectively. Out of this darkness, however, came a few unexpected changes. The staggering loss of life forced societies to rethink labor, wages, and even the rights of peasants. In the end, the Black Death was a grim lesson about the dangers of poor sanitation and the high cost of ignorance. But it also pushed Europe slowly toward a new understanding of public health, paving the way for scientific revolutions yet to come. Thank you for watching. Comment 1 if you're staying for more wild history. The Sun King's Court. Hygiene at Versailles in the 17th century. Step inside the dazzling halls of Versailles, and it's easy to be swept away by gold leaf, sparkling chandeliers, and endless mirrors. But behind all that royal splendor, court life under King Louis XIV, better known as the Sun King, wasn't nearly as glamorous as it looked. In fact, when it came to hygiene, Versailles was a palace built on luxury and a surprising amount of filth. Bathing, as we know it, was actually viewed with suspicion. Many people, including the king himself, believed that soaking in hot water could weaken the body or open the pores to disease. So, while the palace overflowed with perfume and powder, actual baths were rare events. Louis XIV reportedly preferred to wipe himself down with linen towels dipped in alcohol or scented water. Daily routines included changing into fresh clothes, sometimes several times a day, dabbing on generous amounts of perfume, and always being careful to wash the hands and face. For the Sun King, a spritz of cologne or a scented handkerchief was often considered cleaner than a tub of water. Privacy in Versailles? Nearly non-existent. The royal court was a world of constant attention and activity, where even personal needs were public. Many courtiers used chamber pots in their rooms, but there were also public latrines scattered throughout the palace. Hardly places of comfort or dignity. With so many people living, working, and gossiping in close quarters, unpleasant odors became part of everyday life. Travelers and diplomats frequently wrote about the overwhelming stench that clung to Versailles, no matter how many bouquets of flowers or bowls of potpourri tried to mask it. And then there were the pests. The Grand Palace, originally built on swampy ground, was a paradise for fleas, lice, and mice. Cats roamed the halls in an attempt to keep the rodent population in check. The color puce, a kind of purplish brown, actually got its name from the French word for flea, inspired by the dark marks these insects left on fabric and furniture. Even the food reflected Versailles' hygiene struggles. Kitchens were overrun with servants, animals, and pests. Food poisoning and dental disasters were commonplace. Louis XIV lost all his teeth by the end of his life, leading him to favor soft foods. King Louis XIV made Versailles the ultimate symbol of royal might, a glittering stage where Europe's elite gathered in awe of absolute power. Beneath all that splendor, however, courtiers spent each day walking a tightrope between outward elegance and the not-so-glamorous realities of pungent odors, hidden pests, and constant discomfort. Victorian era, from miasma theory to early feminine hygiene. Victorian England was a time of grand progress and peculiar habits, a world straddling the old ways and the new. On the surface, it was an age of scientific breakthroughs, elegant fashion, and strict social manners. Yet, beneath the polished veneer, the Victorian obsession with cleanliness often led to some truly unusual and sometimes hazardous hygiene routines. For many Victorians, the battle against disease was fought not with knowledge of germs, but with a nose for foul odors. The dominant belief, known as the miasma theory, insisted that sickness spread through bad air. Summer in London was notorious for its pungent stench, a mix of overflowing cesspools, horse manure, and smoky factories. Perfumes, disinfectants, and herbal sachets were used to mask the smells, but the real causes of illness, like bacteria and viruses, remained a mystery for much of the century. Laundry day was an ordeal in every household, but not just because of hard labor. The methods were surprising by today's standards. Ammonia, borax, and even human or animal urine were all used to whiten and deodorize clothing. Fullers, professional laundry workers, would soak garments in these solutions before pounding, rinsing, and hanging them to dry in the smoky city air. Personal grooming was also going through a transformation. Toothbrushes and tooth powders were available, but mostly for the well-off. The poor often made do with a cloth or chewed on sticks and rags to clean their teeth. Early indoor plumbing arrived in the form of water closets, primitive toilets that often drained into brick-lined cesspools beneath the house. These modern conveniences helped, but they brought their own risks, with unpleasant smells and the ever-present danger of leaks. Hair care was a point of pride. Victorians concocted their own shampoos using eggs, beer, or herbs, always striving for glossy locks. Cosmetics were popular, though not always safe. Arsenic and lead found their way into creams and powders in the pursuit of flawless, pale skin. Perhaps most revolutionary was the gradual public discussion of women's hygiene needs. For the first time, feminine products became commercially available and advice columns began to address menstruation. A step toward breaking old taboos. The world-famous mouthwash Listerine actually got its start way back in 1879. But forget about fresh breath. At first, Listerine was invented as a surgical antiseptic, designed to clean wounds in operating rooms. It wasn't until much later that the company pivoted, transforming Listerine into the minty rinse millions use today for oral hygiene. The Civil War, disease and sanitation on the battlefield. The American Civil War is often remembered for its epic battles and tales of bravery, but for soldiers on both sides, the most relentless enemy wasn't always armed with a rifle. Disease and poor sanitation claimed more lives than any bullet ever could, turning military camps into breeding grounds for misery. As thousands of young men from cities and farms flooded into makeshift camps, the conditions quickly became unbearable. Tents were packed tightly together, offering little protection from the elements or the stench of unwashed bodies. Fresh uniforms were a point of pride at first, but laundry facilities were scarce, and it wasn't long before clothing became grimy and lice-ridden. Soldiers often had no choice but to share not just tents but socks and undergarments, a perfect recipe for spreading skin infections and parasites. Waste disposal posed a constant challenge. Latrines, if they existed at all, were often hastily dug and rarely maintained. Many soldiers, exhausted or simply unaware, relieved themselves wherever they could, leading to contaminated water supplies and the rapid spread of diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and cholera. Clean water was precious, and many drank from the same streams used for bathing and laundry, further fueling outbreaks of illness. Despite official orders encouraging weekly baths, the realities of camp life made regular washing nearly impossible. After days or weeks in the field, a soldier might only have a muddy river or rainwater for washing, if he was lucky. Food was another battleground. Rations were meager, often spoiled, and rarely included fresh fruits or vegetables. Malnutrition left men weak and more vulnerable to disease. Wounds received in battle brought their own dangers. The concept of antiseptic surgery was still years away, and infection was almost inevitable after even minor injuries. Amputation became a grimly routine procedure, seen as the only hope to stop infection from spreading. Doctors and nurses did their best, but without knowledge of germs, every operation was a roll of the dice. The scale of disease and death in the camps shocked the nation and led to a growing push for better public health practices. Reformers advocated for improved sanitation, organized nursing, and stricter standards of cleanliness, changes that would shape the future of American medicine long after the last shots were fired. For many, the true legacy of the Civil War wasn't just written in blood, but in the drive to make military and civilian life safer and more humane. The Wild West, hygiene on the frontier. Life on the American frontier was a test of endurance, not just against the elements or outlaws, but also against dirt, dust, and all the little miseries of daily survival. Forget any notion of fresh linens or sparkling washrooms. Out west, staying clean was a daily challenge, and for many pioneers, hygiene was often little more than a hope. Dust was everywhere. It drifted in on the wind, coated clothes and skin, and found its way into every meal. Settlers and cowboys quickly learned that no matter how hard you tried, the battle against grime was never truly won. Bathing was a rare luxury, especially in remote settlements. When water was available, families might share the same tub, reheating the water for each new bather until it was more mud than bath. Soap, if you had it, was usually homemade from animal fat and lye, though people also relied on natural remedies, like soapweed, a wild plant used by some for washing hair. Toilets as we know them today were nearly unheard of. Most folks made do with outhouses, simple wooden shacks with a pit below, or just headed for the nearest patch of woods or prairie. Toilet paper didn't exist. Instead, people reached for whatever was handy: corn cobs, leaves, or old scraps of newspaper. Privacy was rare, but practicality ruled the day. Sleeping quarters didn't offer much relief from discomfort. Mattresses, if they could be called that, were often bags stuffed with hay or straw. With time, these beds became havens for lice, fleas, and bedbugs, which could make for long, restless nights. Getting rid of pests was an uphill battle, fought with boiling water, strong sunlight, and a great deal of patience. Water for drinking, cooking, and cleaning was a resource to be guarded closely. Rivers, streams, and wells were lifelines, but they were also easily contaminated, especially when laundry, dishwashing, and bathing all happened in the same place. Waterborne diseases were common threats in frontier towns and camps. Out on the frontier, survival demanded creativity and grit. Hygiene was rarely perfect, but it was always a reflection of the land's challenges and the hard-won resourcefulness of the people who called it home. Out of all these wild hygiene stories, which one did you find the most unbelievable? Titanic, luxury, class, and hygiene at sea. When the RMS Titanic set sail in 1912, it was more than just a ship. It was a floating city promising the height of luxury and technological innovation. For many, boarding the Titanic meant stepping into a world of elegance, where even hygiene and comfort were designed to dazzle. But, as with so much else in history, your experience on board depended a lot on where you stood in the social order. First-class passengers lived in opulence. Their cabins rivaled the finest hotel suites, complete with running water, flushing toilets, and even bathtubs, unheard-of luxuries for travelers at sea. The Turkish bath was a marvel, offering steam rooms and massage tables for those looking to unwind after a formal dinner. Attendants and personal servants were always on hand to lay out fresh linens or help guests change for the next event. Maintaining cleanliness and comfort was an art, performed by an invisible army of stewards and maids who worked around the clock to polish every surface and keep the dining rooms and lounges spotless. Second-class travelers also fared well. They enjoyed comfortable cabins, well-kept bathrooms, and access to sanitary facilities that would put many hotels of the era to shame. Public restrooms were regularly cleaned, and hot water was available for bathing, a small but meaningful touch for families making long journeys across the ocean. Life was much different below deck. Third-class or steerage passengers, mostly immigrants dreaming of a better life, lived in shared cabins and made do with communal sinks and simple toilets. Before even stepping aboard, these passengers underwent health inspections to limit the risk of infectious disease. An early reminder of the public health concerns that haunted large groups of travelers. Privacy was limited and amenities were basic, but for many, the conditions still surpassed what they'd left behind. Regardless of class, the Titanic was equipped with a fully staffed hospital and a ship's doctor, ready to care for passengers in need. Strict cleaning regimens helped prevent the spread of illness, and the ship's kitchens worked day and night to serve meals with gleaming cutlery and spotless plates. Even pets were pampered. First-class travelers brought dogs, cats, and birds, who stayed in their own onboard kennels. Beneath all this polish, the Titanic's hygiene standards reflected both the promise and the limits of early 20th century technology. For the wealthy, it was a golden age of comfort. For others, it was a step up from hardship, but not yet a ticket to luxury. Hygiene in space, challenges and solutions in zero gravity. Living in space might sound like science fiction, but for astronauts, even the simplest routines, like staying clean, turn into complicated challenges. There's no gravity to help water flow, so traditional showers are out of the question. Instead, astronauts rely on rinseless body wipes, a splash of water from a pouch, and no-rinse shampoo to keep themselves fresh. For shaving, special razors with vacuum attachments capture stray hairs before they can float away. Going to the bathroom in zero gravity is another adventure. Space toilets use airflow and suction to direct waste into sealed containers. Nothing can be left floating around. Used water, including urine, is filtered and recycled into drinking water, maximizing every precious drop. Laundry isn't possible, so clothing is worn repeatedly until it must be discarded. Every detail is carefully planned, because in a closed environment, odors and germs can quickly become a problem. Regular cleaning, strict hygiene kits, and powerful ventilation systems help keep the International Space Station habitable. Far from Earth, astronauts rely on creativity, technology, and teamwork, proving that even among the stars, good hygiene is never out of this world. From ancient bathhouses to astronauts scrubbing up in zero gravity, the story of staying clean has always shaped our lives. The legacy of slavery still shapes America, reminding us of the courage and suffering of those who came before us. Let's keep their stories alive and continue striving for a more just future. If anything moved you or if we missed a perspective, share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe, share Past Not Past, and join us for more journeys through history. Always thank you for watching.